Okay, I think we've got a critical mass, so why don't we go ahead and get started. I'm Dan Slater. I'm the director here at WCED, Weiser Center for Emerging Democracies, and very, very happy today to have this terrific roundtable on the theme of democratic ceilings. And as many of you may have heard, there's been quite a bit of discussion lately about things like democratic erosion, democratic backsliding. This has become almost a new paradigm through which people are thinking about problems of democracy in the world. And Gerardo Munck and Aram will be presenting the case, and we have arranged a set of papers which will make the case that we should also be thinking about this in terms of the lasting stagnation of existing democracies, and not only of democracies that are going through some sudden downturn in their quality. So it's quite a provocative project. I'm a big fan of it, and really honored that we have all these great authors together today here to talk about the project. Let me briefly introduce our roundtable participants, and then we'll get started. So first of all, Aram is assistant professor of political science at the University of Missouri. Her research focuses on nationalism and democracy in East Asia, with particular emphasis on issues of identity change, integration, and democratic support in the Korean Peninsula and Taiwan. Her work has been published in the British Journal of Political Science, Comparative Politics, Electoral Studies, and the Journal of East Asian Studies. Gerardo Munck is professor of political science and international relations at the University of Southern California. His research focuses on political regimes and democracy, methodology, in Latin America. His forthcoming and most recent books include Latin American Politics and Society, a comparative and historical analysis with Juan Pablo Luna, Critical Junctures and Historical Legacies, edited with David Collier, and A Middle Inequality Institutional Trap, Democracy and State Capacity in Latin America with Sebastian Mazuka. Grigore Pop-Eleches is professor of politics and international affairs at Princeton University. His main research interests lie at the intersection between comparative and international political economy, with a particular interest in Eastern Europe and Latin America. He's the author of 2 books, From Economic Crisis to Reform, IMF Programs in Latin America and Eastern Europe, and Communism's Shadow, Historical Legacies and Contemporary Political Attitudes. Daniel Treisman is professor of political science at UCLA and a research associate of the National Bureau of Economic Research. His work focuses on Russian politics and economics, as well as comparative political economy. He has published 4 books, most recently The Return, Russia's Journey from Gorbachev to Medvedev, and articles in journals including the American Political Science Review and the American Economic Review, as well as in public affairs journals, Foreign Affairs, and Foreign Policy. And finally, we're very happy today to have our very own Ricarda serving as the respondent. Ricarda is the WCED Postdoctoral Fellow for 2021 to 2023, after which she will be assistant professor of sociology at UC Berkeley. Her research interests lie at the intersection of global, historical, and post-colonial sociology. She received her PhD in sociology from Brown University in 2021, and she is currently working on her book manuscript, Citizenship and Colonial Difference, the Racial Politics of Rights and Rule Across the Black Atlantic. So we've got a great lineup, lots to get through, and I want to start by turning things over to Aram and Jerry to give us a sense of the overall outlines of the project.
Okay, thank you very much, Dan. Thanks for that introduction. Thanks for hosting this meeting. Looking forward to an interesting discussion here. Let me give some broad contours about this project that I'm working with Aram and the people that are collected here. Starting with some broad statements, yes. The world is not experiencing a third wave of de-democratization, a third reverse wave. More specifically, democratic backsliding, though important as an issue in many countries, is not the dominant trend in the world of democracy. We see, however, increasingly within academia and outside of academia, what we call an erosion narrative taking hold, as though this were the dominant, the most pervasive problem for those of us concerned with democracy. And I think it prevents us from seeing a problem that we're trying to put the focus on, to really sort of start investigating, which we call the problem of democratic ceilings. So this is sort of a key concept that we're trying to introduce here. The idea of a democratic ceiling is obviously drawn from the metaphor of glass ceilings. This comes from the feminist movement about progress that's made by a certain group, but then they stall, they bump into a certain ceiling that affects, in this case, sort of women more than men. And we're adapting that idea to the study of countries, of politics, and post-transitional countries. These are countries that have undergone a democratic transition, so they've made some important progress, have taken some steps, but then they failed to improve the quality of democracy beyond a certain point. And this is even after countries have been democratic, as in the case of the countries we studied, 3 or 4 decades. Became democratic in the context of the third wave, and then they seem to have gotten stuck, stalled in their democratic development. As part of this broader agenda that we're trying to contribute in the study of democracy, I think we can talk about 2 overarching questions. One has to do with how should we characterize countries that have hit a democratic ceiling? We're basically saying that they're missing some aspects of what we see as a high quality democracy. But I think we need to be more precise about what are the specific problems that countries are suffering from. I think sort of that will then help us focus our efforts at theorizing. The second is how can we explain the lack of progress in certain countries? And I think here sort of the standard thing we do as academic is go back to ideas that we're familiar with that have been used in the literature. So we have to think, do the usual theories of democratization, de-democratization, do the job in terms of explaining democratic ceilings? Or is there something new going on here and that we actually need to start developing new theories that existing theories don't apply correctly? So with Aram, we started discussing these issues. We found a point of connection. She'd been working on this in the context of East Asia. I'm a Latin American, so thinking about this in the context of Latin America. We assembled a team of people, some doing global analysis, some focusing on different regions, and asked them to consider these basic issues. In terms of the project, we have one global and more historical paper that Dan Treisman has done, looking through a variety of data sets to actually ascertain what are the trends in global politics, what can we do in terms of predicting future trends. So I think that's a very interesting paper that provides a broad framing for the project. And so I basically take as a key contribution the finding that we're not undergoing a democratic recession or a third wave of de-democratization. So that kind of provides some basis for the rest of the papers. Then we essentially have regional focus papers, and we look at the various regions. I'd say sort of these are middle regions with middle income countries, lots of middle income countries, Eastern Europe, Latin America, East Asia. And I think sort of these were the regions, countries within the region where people had the most hope. These countries were going to really make it. They were going to become liberal democracies. And sort of, so I think sort of there's a sense of frustration, sort of a disappointment with the way these countries have progressed since the 1980s broadly. So we have a paper, Aram and a co-author, Andrew Yo, has worked on East Asia, looking particularly at Korea and Taiwan. I have a paper on Latin America. This is a large region in terms of sort of the number of countries, about 19 countries. So there's a lot of diversity there, but sort of focusing on Latin America. Marco and Grigore focus on Eastern Europe, digging deeper into the cases of Romania and Hungary. We have another paper sort of that we're not presenting today, looking at India, which is a very interesting case, sort of that people are seeing as sort of really undergoing serious erosion. Some people even say has undergone a breakdown. So that's part of the broader project. I think we would have loved to have more papers on more regions. I think one of the things that comes out of Dan Treisman's paper is the importance of historical analysis. So we don't do all we basically sort of would like to do, but we hope to trigger interest in this problem of democratic ceilings and trigger a broader debate. Thanks.
Okay, terrific.
Aram,
Yep. Aram, you want to go ahead?
do you want to add something?
Sure, I'll just briefly add, and I don't want to hang up from us from getting started, but this focus and sort of the erosion narrative and highlighting this other sort of distinct phenomenon, I think does 2 things theoretically. I mean, it really starts to shine light on issues of democratic quality. And there was this sort of unease, after the third wave, and this sort of obsession over stability, right? That we wanted democracies to democratize and stay democratic and not go through this authoritarian version. And that was kind of seen as the primary standard for, I think, democratic success. And what this focus on ceilings does is it really starts to decouple the idea of stability from quality. You can have low quality democracies that are actually quite stable and last for a long time. And that causes sort of issues of its own that then manifest in things like erosion, backsliding, et cetera. So really thinking about those two things as two separate things and how do they relate to each other, I think is one thing. The second thing is, really going back to this origin of the metaphor of glass ceilings, taking seriously this idea of democratic ceilings turns attention to sort of more historical, structural, societal factors surrounding democratization itself. So it takes sort of naturally takes kind of more of an historical long view to what we now see as kind of contemporary problems of backsliding. So before we had the rise of demagogues, before we had sort of populist waves, what are some of the structural things that were endemic to the founding of democracies from the get-go that kind of imposed these ceilings on them? So those, I think, are the two areas in which we're really trying to drive the theoretical discussions about democracies.
Okay, terrific. So we do not currently have Dan Treisman here with us yet. And so I wonder if we might want to do some of the area focused papers first in the hopes that we'll have Dan toward the end to present some of his results. Does that sound okay with you guys? I'll defer to the co-editors. Is there any particular order you would like to do the papers in?
I thought the idea was to go with Aram's paper on East Asia, then mine on Latin America, and Grigore's on Eastern Europe.
Sounds perfect. Sounds perfect. Aram?
Good.
Thanks for being flexible there.
Thumbs up. Okay, good. So, Dan Treisman's paper really lays out the overview of, if you look at this quantitatively, that in fact, regression is not the dominant trend. And then he points out sort of different clusters of cases that we would then characterize as democratic ceilings. So East Asia, the one that I'm going to present, is sort of this case of, ceiling at a pretty high, hitting a ceiling at a pretty high point in terms of democratic quality. So East Asian democracies were long seen as sort of the success story of the third wave, but that's coexisted with these kind of undercurrents of illiberalism. So specifically in terms of party competition and weak protection of civil society. And these aren't formal violations of the law, but they are violations of informal democratic norms about fair competition, freedom of opposition. And, our argument in this paper is that, Taiwan and South Korea in particular represent cases of democracies that have hit a ceiling at this relatively high point of quality, and that this sort of intensifying pattern of illiberalism in these democracies is not a cause, but actually a symptom of long-stalled democratic quality. Now, the explanation that we focus on is nationalist polarization in the early phase of democratization. So, nationalist polarization is a specific kind of partisan polarization where the parties are divided on mutually exclusive visions of the nation. And nationalist polarization is so detrimental to democracy because of two reasons. The first is that nationalisms are inherently state-seeking. So the nation is a political community that defines itself as deserving of its own state and its own political authority. So achieving that nation-state congruence, that principle lies at the heart of any nationalist movement and is really what differentiates nationalist movements from other kinds of identity claims like race or class movements. And what that focus on state ownership does is that it reframes the end of democratic competition, not as this competition of policy or ideas, but a competition for an all or nothing capture of the state, and justifying that by any means possible, right? Even ones that do violate democratic principles. And when democracies are born into these kinds of contexts of nationalist polarization, democratization doesn't alleviate, but rather institutionalizes that conflict into the emergent party electoral system. What I mean by that is at the elite level, it promotes a liberal competition between the parties by framing the opposition party not as a fair competitor, but an existential threat to my nationalist vision, literally breaking down the norms of mutual tolerance and forbearance. And then at the mass level, it promotes a liberal tolerance of co-partisans who justify their democratic transgressions in the name of nationalist survival. This is a moral imperative for you to support me because I'm doing this for our nationalist vision, essentially granting them electoral impunity and allowing these things to persist. So what I'm presenting today is a snapshot of a mixed method study that shows how these two things work together to produce democratic ceilings in South Korea and Taiwan. So the first part of the study is a comparative historical analysis, where we process trace how nationalist legacies of authoritarian repression, before we even get to democratization, in both cases kind of laid the groundwork for a liberal party competition post-democratization. So the contours and the content of nationalist conflict are obviously different in South Korea and Taiwan, but in both, authoritarian repression had two important effects. So the first is, you can see here that it consolidated the nationalist opposition. It clarified who these sort of nationalist underdogs were, and through repression really sort of solidified the cleavage around that conflict. And what happens in both cases through democratization is that those outsider nationalist forces merge hands with the pro-democracy activists, right, in an effort to kind of recapture the political authority and ownership over the state. So in South Korea, you see the progressives merging hands with sort of the Minjung or pro-democracy movement in South Korea. And the same thing happens in the case of Taiwan, where the Taiwan nationalists merge with the Dangwei movement, literally outside of the party movement, and now form the basis for the DPP party today. And what you see, that merging is very important because it means that democratization becomes not an end in itself, but a means to a different end of gaining ownership over the state. And this really explains why in both cases, illiberal practices have not eased, but actually intensified as the opposition parties have actually gained more power in the democratic arena, because it was never really about commitment to liberal values per se. It was this competitive competition between two nationalist factions to gain power over the state. So I'm happy to dig into these sort of details in the Q&A, but the point of this is to kind of give you a snapshot of what's going on in these two democracies. But this elite party competition story is really only half of the story, because why in an otherwise stable established democracy would citizens tolerate these kinds of illiberal transgressions? So to look at this, we turn to a survey experiment in the context of South Korea's sort of highly contested COVID response as a great natural laboratory for understanding what drives citizens' illiberal tolerance. And we test whether nationalist appeals by illiberal co-partisans, couching sort of those actions as for the sake of nationalist survival, grants them electoral impunity. So we had 1,500 subjects recruited through Open Survey, one of the most reputable survey firms in South Korea. And those subjects were assigned to one of three conditions. So this is the control condition. They saw this news card. And the Korean there reads, candidate Kim is a small business owner in his 50s, known to be a family man to his wife and two daughters. Based on his successful management experience, he plans to campaign on the platform of the problem is unemployment, solution is right kind of economic growth, and has already received support from the Together Democratic Party. This is the progressive liberal party in South Korea today, and also the party that's in the administration currently handling the COVID response. This is the illiberal treatment. After the control message, subjects in this group see this second news card that says, however, Mr. Kim has repeatedly stated that the media and civil society groups who criticize the government's COVID response should be punished. quote, citizens have an unconditional duty to follow their government, end quote, he recently said in an interview. So here, clearly sort of not a violation of the law per se, right, but sort of violating democratic norms of civil society protection, freedom of opposition, freedom to criticize. The third group sees this final news card after the illiberal treatment. Quote, when the nation's survival and safety is under threat, freedom of expression is not absolute, even in a democracy. Now, these treatment conditions were sourced from sort of real quotes that were given by South Korean government officials during this time, not necessarily in the context of COVID, but in other contexts. And this is a real debate that is going on in South Korea today. So in terms of treatment outcomes, we looked at both the willingness to still vote for candidate Kim and also ratings about favorability of him from a 1 to 10 scale. So the thing that I want to point out here first is that comparing the first column and the control to the first illiberal treatment condition, South Korean voters are willing to punish for illiberalism, right? So they're not blindly following their party by any means on this. But when they frame that transgression in sort of for the sake of the nation, you see this bounce back in terms of willingness to vote for that candidate. Of about, the recovery is about 1/3 of the loss of electoral support. And when we divide the respondents by party affiliation, that effect is largest for liberals. That bounce back here, in both outcomes, is about half of the electoral punishment loss that they incurred for making illiberal statements. And I think it's important to point out that in the nationalist justification condition, that willingness to vote for that candidate is still over 0.5. So a liberal voter is still more likely than not to still vote for candidate Kim when his illiberal statements are framed in this framework of nationalist survival. But then the question is, well, how do we know if this is actually due to partisan nationalist polarization as opposed to sort of a more general nationalism treatment where, voters are sort of blinded to any kind of conflict or hardship or problems? And here, really looking at the conservatives, which is the lightest bar on the right-hand side, is a good check. Because as you can see, the conservatives remain entirely unmoved by this nationalist appeal. And that's actually quite strange because COVID-19 response affects welfare safety of everybody in the nation, however you want to splice national boundaries, right? So what this seems to signal to us is that voters selectively respond to nationalist appeals from their own party, which signals sort of this nationalist polarization effect. And so, to wrap up really quickly, this long shadow of nationalist polarization really highlights the long-term effects of structural or societal factors at the time of democratization. Even before we get to sort of more contemporary developments that have been more the focus of democratic backsliding debates on, rise of demagogues, populist upheavals, etc. And East Asian case, I want to be clear here, though, that nationalist polarization is neither unique to East Asia, nor is it a unique explanation for democratic ceilings. I think the East Asian cases represent a phenomenon that's actually found in many regions that relate to sort of modernization, where nation building pressures and democratization pressures coincided. Such that a lot of these democracies were born into context or born from nationalist conflict rather than from a place of established nationhood and national unity. And so nationalist polarization remains sort of a uniquely important lens for understanding democratic ceilings in East Asia and why they seem to persist. Thank you.
Okay, terrific. Great to have East Asia brought into these conversations. And next, we're going to turn it back over to Jerry Munck to talk about Latin America.
Okay, thanks, Aram, for getting us started in such an interesting way. I'm going to focus on Latin America. This is a fairly large, diverse region, 19 countries. If you go back to the 1980s, 1990s, it's a success region in terms of the story of democratization. It's probably the region that most homogeneously was part of the third wave of democratization. The standard thing to say was by the year 2000, all of Latin America, except for one case, Cuba, had become democratic. So there's no region that moves so sort of homogeneously toward democracy. Those of us who studied democracy in Latin America at that point started to focus on the concept used then, democratic consolidation. The region had undergone lots of cycles toward and away from democratization. So the question was, were these countries going to retain democracy? This was very important. This is a region of many military coups, several decades of that, very high levels of inequality. So just retaining democracy was seen as a fundamental achievement. We can now look in retrospect, 30, 40 years in many cases, and essentially have a mixed assessment. There's something very positive to say. Latin America has essentially retained their democracies. There are a few cases of breakdown, Venezuela, Nicaragua, but if you take sort of the majority of the countries, sort of their success in terms of retaining democracy. More and more, however, we've basically had to be more critical about the kind of democracies that have been attained. This is linked with the discussion, a very global discussion about the quality of democracy. And people are basically saying, we have democracies, these are stable, so two very good things, but they're essentially poor quality democracies. There are various ways in which people have characterized sort of what the problems are, but essentially we're coming to terms sort of 30, 40 years after the third wave of democratization. Latin America has stable, durable democracies, but of poor quality. So that's basically sort of what's framing the agenda in a fair amount of discussion. Not everybody sort of is thinking in these terms in the study of democracy in Latin America. So my paper starts to sort of characterize and try to explain current democracy in Latin America. My paper is more theoretical than empirical. I'll give you a bit of a flavor of some of the key points I make. I'll start with two very general points in terms of how to approach the study of democracy in contemporary Latin America. I think that the existence of durable, poor quality democracies is certainly a novel phenomena in Latin America. I'm pretty sure about that. I've studied democracy historically. Never has there been a period where democracy has lasted for this long. So this is something that's clearly novel in Latin America that people haven't thought about, theorized. I'm not quite sure about making the statement here. Sort of Dan Treisman may have something to say, whether this is something novel on a global scale, sort of thinking about the last 200 years of history. But I'd say that our image about how stable democracies function is very much shaped by the post-World War II Western European experience. So we have certain maps, sort of certain ideas about how you have in the democratic equilibrium that is owed very much to Europe. And I think sort of one needs to start with the specifics of a region. I'm concerned with Latin America to understand how to explain that, not to seek to just simply transpose some ideas that are more developed in the context of Europe, and essentially think that Latin America is going to be following a similar path as Europe just a few decades later on. The second sort of overarching point in terms of how to theorize the current situation. I think the transitions to democracy in Latin America in the 80s, 90s happened due to a series of factors. Dictators were removed, elections became the basic means of accessing power. Once you have elections, once you have elected officials, civilians, I think a new process starts. And I think sort of we need a different explanation. We need to bring in different factors that we can use to explain transition to democracy and how we'd explain the stability of low quality democracies. So I think some of our sort of very nice theorizing doesn't exactly work. So I think there is a need to have some new theories to explain sort of this current phenomena. Just going to the argument sort of that I develop in the paper, the overarching factor that I focus on is the state. So I'm trying to bring the state into the discussions of democratization. I'm not saying that that's the only, even sort of the main factor, but it's one that I think is important to understand the current situation in Latin America that we haven't discussed enough. And the argument essentially is that democratic regimes starting in the 1980s, 1990s were affected by the states that they inherited. These were states that were largely formed that had certain characteristics a long time earlier, the middle of the 19th century. These were really exogenous factors that affected how democracy was going to function in the wake of democratic transitions. Specifically, Latin America has semi-patrimonial states. So I'm using a Weberian concept of patrimonialism, bureaucratic state. One can get into a bit more of a discussion about what exactly semi-patrimonialism is. But the argument I present, or the overarching thesis, is that the semi-patrimonial character of Latin American states affected the evolution of the region's democracies by activating certain causal mechanisms that both curtail democratic progress and stabilize democracy. I think there's a conceptual issue, and this has come up in various discussions that I've had of this paper, about thinking about the link between the state and democracy. I think we're very comfortable distinguishing democracy and the economy, democracy and culture. These are sort of clearly distinct kind of factors. It's harder to distinguish, and I don't think we spent enough time distinguishing democratic regimes from state. One of my collaborators, Sebastian Mazuca, wrote a nice piece in 2010, really insisting that we needed to unpack these things. This was a bit of a critique of somebody that's influenced many of us, Guillermo O'Donnell. I think a lot of the literature, Guillermo O'Donnell and many others contributed to, started to bring the state into the concept of democracy. So we're trying to unpack, disaggregate the state from the democratic regime, thinking about the types of regimes, one being democratic, the types of state. So the biggest part of the paper, sort of the effort in the paper, is to spell out how agents of the state affect democratic politics. They can act sort of with politicians, with social actors, businesses, sort of sometimes it's collusion, but a key part is played by agents of the state that have certain characteristics, that engage in certain behaviors that you wouldn't see in a bureaucratic state as you'd see in sort of European, Scandinavian countries. Just to get a bit of a flavor of the argument, let me focus on two parts. State agents in the public administration, security forces, the judiciary, are active and passive participants in many acts of corruption, bribe, taking, using of state resources for the purpose of electoral clientelism. In some cases, Mexico provides many examples. State agents in the security forces actually participate in the intimidation of candidates. Sometimes they collude with drug cartels. Electoral management bodies, electoral tribunals, sometimes do not have the independence, the autonomy, you could say the power to sanction electoral irregularities. One of the strongest electoral management bodies is the INE in Mexico. They do some things that are pretty fantastic, but currently, if you read the newspapers, López Obrador is targeting them, criticizing them, defunding them. So some of the aspects of the state that are meant to ensure the clean electoral process are curtailed. Those things have to do with the electoral process. I have a discussion of what happens once you have elected governments. And here again, state agents play an important role in facilitating the abuse of power by elected office holders, sometimes raising funds that are used to buy off legislators. In some cases, we're talking about Brazil, Mexico, Argentina. Key pieces of legislation involve bribes that state agents offer to legislatures. There's a lot of evidence in terms of the working of the judiciary, in terms of fighting acts of corruption. in which the judiciary essentially is bought off by politicians, ensure the impunity of politicians. All this basically provides an account of why you have very poor quality democracies. Some people say, well, sometimes it doesn't even look like it's democratic. So that's an interesting debate. But then the question is, why is this stable? And I'll round up with these comments. I think we could think of two feedback loops, and I talk about balancing feedback loops that sort of, in some sense, underpin an equilibrium. There are certain actions that happen in the context of elections that violate basic electoral procedures, democratic procedures, that allow you to attain electoral office. Once you're in office, you can then sort of, in some sense, cement, continue with those electoral practices. There's really no incentive that actors face to clean up the system. Every now and then we have outsiders that come to power that promise that they're going to clean up the system. They usually end up being sort of, becoming part of the system. So sometimes you have hopes that with alternation, and you have alternation, that you'd have a break in the system. Basically, sort of these groups become co-opted. In some sense, they use those same means to their advantage. One other way that could think about the possibility of change is through serious reform of the state. If the state is so important in terms of affecting the quality of democracy, one can think one could endogenize sort of the quality of the state. Democratic authorities could reform the state. But essentially, we see I spell out the argument in some detail, why poor quality democracies in the context of the economies of Latin America are not able to muster the power, sort of enough consensus to initiate a serious reform of the state. So my conclusion is that Latin America is stuck. I've used sort of a middle quality institutional trap in the work that Dan referred to with Sebastian Mazuca. Basically emphasize the two parts. So that's, as I said at the beginning, the positive and the negative. On the positive side, I don't think we have a fear of imminent breakdown of democracy. Sometimes you have erosion of democracy, but sort of countries then bounce back. I'd say sort of that most of the powerful actors prefer the democracies that Latin America has to dictators. Again, there are a few exceptions, but I'd say in terms of the broad pattern, democracy has become sort of the only game in town. On the negative side, the democracy that is supported is this democracy with a whole series of flaws, and you don't have sort of the coalition, sort of the incentives for actors to push for the kind of reforms that would lead to breaking through a democratic ceiling, improving the quality of democracy. Thank you.
Okay, thanks so much, Jerry. And next we're going to go over to Grigore to bring us to Eastern Europe.
Thanks a lot. Let me see if I can share the screen here with you. So here, can you see it? Yeah, okay. So yeah, so this is work with Marco Klaśnia, and in a sense we're picking up on some of these themes on democratic ceilings and countries getting stuck. We're doing a bit more of a deep dive by looking at attitudes and really with a particular focus on Romania, though with broader implications to sort of post-communist countries. And so just as a way to motivate this discussion a little bit, so here we see the evolution of liberal democracy as measured by VDEM, and the top line is Western Europe. Underneath that are the new EU members from Eastern Europe. And on the bottom is the rest of post-communist Eastern Europe. For now, you can ignore the Romanian case here. And what we see here are two things, right? We see that liberal democracy, even in the new EU members, has not quite converged to the levels of Western Europe. In other words, up until about 2012 to 14 or so, we see more or less a ceiling. And then we do see, at least in this case, driven to a large extent by Hungary and Poland, but to some extent also by a few other countries, some backsliding. So I think it's important to keep that in mind a little bit for the discussion here. Our focus is on how this is linked to corruption, as you can see here also measured by VDEM. Here, the East European countries are much more below the levels of Western Europe. In other words, the ceiling is there, but it's significantly lower. And similarly, obviously, and at even worse levels for other ex-communist countries, right? And so the question is, okay, fine. So in some sense, these may both be sort of static pictures. How do we know that they're related? One thing we did, and unfortunately we did this after we sent out the paper, so I apologize to our discussants and to everybody else for springing new stuff on you at this point. But we did a very simple exercise, which is to run these regressions on changes in 5-year changes in liberal democracy as a function of prior corruption. So corruption in year T-5, explaining changes in liberal democracy. And what you see that in places, so on the left side of the figure, in places with low corruption, the predicted change over 5 years is positive. Once you get even to sort of middling levels of corruption, it's slightly negative. And for very corrupt countries, this relationship is even more negative. And the magnitude of the difference between a high and a low corruption case, the difference in liberal democracy change is about equivalent to 1 standard deviation in the change in liberal democracy. In other words, it does seem that this is not just a case of these countries having both low corruption and low liberal democracy, but the fact that there seems to be some sort of a dynamic relationship between them. Now, what we do in our paper is we look at some of the attitudinal micro foundations for this. There's a very sort of straightforward set of first-order expectations, which is that corruption undermines trust in institutions, it undermines democracy support, and conversely, successful anti-corruption should have the opposite effect. And we do show in our appendix that is indeed seems to be the case. In other words, the fact that you have these significant problems with corruption in this region really does undermine a lot of the sort of public opinion on democracy, with potential implications, obviously, for stability and deepening and so on. But from this perspective, basically, the problem here is that there's not enough anti-corruption, and as long as we could just sort of push for it, things would improve, right? Both on corruption, but potentially also on liberal democracy. What we focus on in our paper, though, is a bit of a potential risk of anti-corruption, and that comes out of 2 issues which we talk about a little bit more in just a bit. One of them being the pervasive partisan bias and polarization that's the case in a lot of these countries. And the fact that very often anti-corruption tends to rely on questionable methods. It's very hard to prosecute anti-corruption. Very often prosecutors use a variety of sort of questionable means, from wiretapping to various sort of prosecutor strategies that might be tricky. And in this sense, public opinion is actually potentially buttressing some of these risks, right? Whereas on the sort of in the first order expectations, public opinion goes towards improving things. Here it's potentially problematic. And just to sort of talk about our hypothesis. So the first hypothesis is pretty straightforward, right? Is that in the face of persistent corruption that we've seen, you'd expect to see support for this kind of ends justifies means anti-corruption. In other words, as long as you can get these corrupt politicians into jail, we don't really care how you do it, right? And this should be particularly salient for people who care a lot about corruption. The other aspect is that in the context of highly partisan and highly polarized partisan competition, you'd expect this to apply to anti-corruption attitudes as well, right? So if everything in politics is polarized on partisan lines, there's no reason to expect anti-corruption to be different. And then, of course, if we put these two things together, we might expect partisan divisions in support for these kinds of questionable anti-corruption means, right? Which then, of course, has broader implications, which we don't specifically test, but discuss towards the end about what this means for the fate of anti-corruption and potentially for the fate of democracy more broadly. So in terms of research design, we focus on Romania. It's a pretty representative post-communist case. You see it here on the right. It's the red. It's the red curve. It has a sort of pretty high corruption and pretty significant sort of liberal democracy ceiling. Marco and I have a paper on what we call dirty democracies and discuss Romania in that context, right? So there is places where you have free elections, you know, all the sort of civil liberties and so on that you would want from a sort of reasonably well-functioning democracy, but at the same time you have rule of law problems, you have high corruption, you have a variety of things that don't quite work well. Where Romania is a bit different is that it has had, as you can see on the right side here, it's improved fairly significantly in terms of corruption, partly because of this fairly significant, very effective set of anti-corruption institutions. So what we do in the paper, and most of you have read it, so I'm not going to go into too much detail here. We have two survey experiments where we, in one, we prime the partisanship of the person being accused of corruption. In the other one, we focus on shady versus legitimate methods of evidence gathering, and then see how people react to them as a basis for this. And then we have another one, which is based on a survey that was in the field at the time when the Romanian government put in the so-called government ordinance 13, which decriminalized anti-corruption. So this can be seen as a sort of pro-corruption shock in some sense. And then there were massive protests in Romania in the weeks following that. The government withdrew it. So we can think of that as a sort of positive corruption shock, and we can sort of look at attitudes before and after this in our survey. So really quickly, in terms of results, as far as the first hypothesis, first thing to note is that overall, so these are the dark bars on the left, there is fairly high support. It's over almost 65% of people support the anti-corruption agencies cooperating with the secret police, which in the context of a country like Romania, that's obviously somewhat worrisome. What we see with the light gray bars over here is that this proportion is even higher among people who say that they're likely to protest against corruption, i.e. for people who really care about this more, right? We see sort of similar patterns for a question that said whether people approve of the idea that anti-corruption should be done by any means necessary, even if it means breaking the law. Here, about 40% of people agree, so it's not quite a majority, but it's a substantial plurality. And again, we see that this is stronger among people who really care about corruption. Then from the survey experiment, where basically it is a very simple vignette where we said, a mayor from this or that party is accused of corruption. And then they were asked whether they thought that the mayor was guilty. And as you would expect, but the magnitude is fairly large for such a simple vignette, people are much more likely to think that the politician is guilty if he's from the other party, right? We see similar patterns in terms of preferences for punishment. So when it's your own guys, so here we have a variety of, it's the same vignette experiment, but we have different possible punishments ranging from lifetime bans from politics to shorter bans, 5-year jail sentence versus a suspended jail sentence. And what we see is systematically, and especially for the harsher sentences, we see that people are much more punitive against the other guys. So they both think that the other guys are more guilty of corruption, and they're much more willing to throw them in jail and throw away the key. we see similar patterns. Since I'm relatively short of time, I'm not going to talk about this in great detail, but similar pattern from that experiment, from the quasi-natural experiment with the government ordinance. So when the opposition partisans basically thought that when the ordinance was enacted, things got much worse. Once that got reversed, it's the government partisans who think so. So in other words, again, these are pretty starkly different perceptions of what anti-corruption means in this kind of a context. And then finally, when we put those two things together, we had a second experiment where we told people that evidence against a corrupt mayor, again from different parties, was obtained either by a wiretap, which is illegal in Romania, or by a recording from an employee, which is not. And here again, what we see is that the reactions to these illegal methods are much more positive when the target is opponent, and more negative when the target is a co-partisan. So as far as conclusions, at some level, what we have uncovered here is that one type of rule of law violations, like corruption, tend to breed receptiveness to different rule of law violations. In this case, not following up on sort of legal provisions for proper prosecutions and so on. And of course, this is the problem is that this is exacerbated by the partisan bias, both in how corruption is perceived and in the preferences for how it should be punished. Right now, zooming back out to the broader implications, I think we see two threats from the sort of microdynamics we've discussed here. One of them is that the politicization along partisan lines of anti-corruption means that it can undermine anti-corruption efforts. If this is credibly seen as a witch hunt, then these kinds of institutions lose credibility and basically cannot fight these democratic ceilings that are imposed by problems like corruption, right? So it weakens these institutions. Alternatively, and here the prediction is even more pessimistic in some sense, we worry that under the guise of anti-corruption, you might actually get real witch hunts and real repression. So lots of authoritarian governments, from Putin to Orban to various others, have used anti-corruption, whether real or made up, to go after their political adversaries. And this potentially means that while there may be a ceiling in terms of not being able to get above a certain level of democracy, there may not necessarily be a durable floor. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Grigore. And you're zooming out, and now we're going to zoom out even further with Dan Treisman. He's going to give us more of the global picture on democratic ceilings as opposed to democratic erosion. So Dan, whenever you're ready.
Okay, first of all, can you hear me?
We can.
Great. Okay, let me try and share the screen. Okay, and can you see the screen?
Yep, looks good.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so yes, this is a very big picture. Basically, this paper was a response to the atmosphere of the last 5 years or so with regard to democracy. There seemed to be a common view that democracy was in crisis, both in the US and worldwide, and a kind of folk theory that this crisis was determined by a weakening of support for democracy in the general public in many countries, and possibly also by an erosion of norms of democratic behavior. So lots of people have been writing about the extent of this crisis and expressing a great deal of anxiety about the future of democracy. So I wanted to basically do a reality check, just look at some data, what data we have on the state of democracy around the world and on public opinion about democracy, and to the extent possible, the erosion of norms among elites. So I looked at the standard measures of democracy that people tend to use in empirical work. Of course, none of these is perfect, but it turns out they tell a somewhat similar story. I'll of course, with some nuances, some differences, which I'll get to. So if we simply look at measures of democracy, and this is the proportion of democracies around the world using different measures, what we see is that using some indicators, there really hasn't been a decrease in the proportion of democracies in the world in recent years, at least not yet. Some other measures, especially VDEM and Freedom House, do show some backsliding. But if we look a bit more closely at those cases, it turns out that the extent of backsliding brings us just back to the situation as of the 1990s, the mid or late 1990s, when, if you remember, democracy was perceived as being in the ascendant, really having triumphed after the end of the Cold War. Are existing democracies breaking down at a faster rate than previously? That might be the case, even though the total number is not decreasing much. Well, looking at the data on that, it seems there's not much evidence that the breakdown of democracy is occurring at a faster rate. Most of these indicators don't suggest that. It's a bit different with the VDEM data, especially the VDEM liberal democracy measure does suggest an increase in the rate of breakdown. But there's something interesting about that, which is that VDEM in 2018 changed its operationalization of liberal democracy, its regimes of the world variable. And it turns out that of the 10 liberal democracies that in VDEM's data became no longer liberal democracies after 2018, 7 of them would have remained liberal democracies if they hadn't made this change in their definitions. So my reading of these and various other data is that the number of democracies worldwide is either at or pretty close to an all-time high, despite the general view that this isn't the case. Where indicators do suggest backsliding, it seems only to have been to around the level of global democracy of the 1990s. And most indicators suggest that the rate of breakdowns and deteriorations is not particularly high, although there does seem to have been some recent trend towards illiberalism. So, okay, there's been a literature on how breakdowns of democracy occur or how democracies end. And the general finding is that fewer coups, more backsliding. And we see that in the graphs using different measures here. But we also see that it's not so much that the extent of backsliding has increased a lot. It's more that the frequency of coups has gone down a lot. Okay, so to try and understand a bit more about the situation of democracies and the factors determining this, I ran some fairly standard models, statistical models, to, first of all, determine what factors help to explain breakdowns of democracy. So these are survival models, and I put in factors which the literature suggests are important. And the results were not surprising. I confirmed with these models, first of all, that higher income and a higher growth rate, higher income is associated with less breakdown of democracy. A high growth rate is associated with less breakdown of democracy, and greater total time as a democracy is associated with a lower risk of breakdown of democracy. Those results were robust. There were various other factors which were sometimes significant, but not always. Okay, and some presidential system post-Cold War controlling for other variables weren't robustly significant at all. So having confirmed that certain factors are important, that allows us to use simple models to estimate just how great the risk is in a given year for a given country. And when I use the models constructed in this way to predict the hazard that the US would fall below the lower bound of democracy using either of these measures, this is what I get. So we see relatively high risk in the early 1800s, also during the Civil War period, for VDEM, because the data for liberal democracy only start, or VDEM classifies the US as a liberal democracy only from 1920. So it had not had many years as a democracy then. So the risk starts relatively high, especially with the Great Depression. But with both measures, what the models suggest, and of course these are to be taken with several grains of salt, what the models suggest is that by recent decades, the estimated risk that a country with the income, the democratic experience, and the economic performance of the US, the risk of breakdown of democracy was really extremely low. Now, given the importance of income levels to sustaining democracy, we might expect that there would be a certain amount of backsliding in recent decades. Why is that? Well, because during the third wave, which started in 1974 and led to this massive increase in the number of democracies, a lot of countries that were relatively less developed democratized. And so the balance, the average income among the within the pool of democracies went down quite significantly after the third wave. So just based on the lower average level of income of the pool of democracies, we might expect to see a certain amount of backsliding. Using the models, I actually was able to estimate how much backsliding we should see based on just the income levels of the countries that were democratic in a given year. And accumulated this, what we see is that the actual rate of breakdowns is pretty well predicted by the models using just the income level of the various democracies in existence. We should have expected, in other words, that about as many democracies would fail as did, just based on their relatively lower income. Okay, so it's often argued that a reason why democracy is in danger, a reason for backsliding in some countries, is that there's been a decline in public support for democracy. Okay, it's not easy to test this because data is limited, but Chris Classen wrote this great paper in which he presented data on levels of public support for democracy in countries around the world. Basically, what he did is he took all the polls available and he kind of averaged them together using a Bayesian model. And so then he tested whether there was a relationship between a decrease in support for democracy using this data and a fall in the level of the VDEM liberal democracy index. And he found a positive relationship that when popular support for democracy falls, you see some fall in the VDEM measured level of democracy. Now, let's forget about endogeneity issues. Clearly, there are some. But can that explain backsliding in the Western liberal democracies where we have seen backsliding? It turns out the answer is no. Why is that? It's because support for democracy in the Western liberal democracies has actually been rising during the period when there were backsliding. So if we just take an average of all the countries that were liberal democracies in 2000, we see that average support for democracy was actually falling till about 2010 using Klassen's data, but then it reversed and it was increasing. And that, of course, is the period in which liberal democracy itself was declining. So it appears that support for democracy was actually rising as liberal democracy on average was declining. And if we look at particular countries, we see a similar pattern. So for Poland, increasing support for democracy as actual democracy, according to Medium, declines. And the same here for the US. Is it erosion of democratic norms among political elites? Well, I found really only one major study of this, which looked at Latin America, Mainwaring and Perez-Lignan. They find that elite actors' commitment to democracy is related to breakdown. But looking at their data, it turns out that their result is really driven by two countries, Argentina and Uruguay. There's no relationship in the other countries. And looking at the breakdowns that occurred in Argentina and Uruguay, in 4 of the 5, what happened was there was a radical pro-dictatorship military which overthrew civilian leaders in a coup. So I take the lesson from that to be that a pro-dictatorship military is dangerous to democracy. It's hard to argue against that. On the other hand, that message doesn't translate very well into the kinds of possible erosion of norms of cooperation and forbearance that we see in most liberal democracies today. Okay, so conclusions very quickly, because I know I'm out of time. The proportion of democracies in the world seems to be close to an all-time high. If there has been some backsliding, and in some countries it certainly has, it's so far globally just to the level of the 1990s. Momentum has clearly slowed or stopped. We're not in a forward period for democratization, but that came after a huge increase during the so-called third wave. Democratic breakdowns tend to be less common at high income levels where the economy is not in depression and when countries have long experience of democracy. Just based on the income levels of the pool of democracies, the extent of backsliding since 2000 is pretty much what we might have expected. Falling support for democracy doesn't explain backsliding in liberal democracies because, in fact, support for democracy seems to have been increasing in the countries and in the period in which Dem sees a fall in actual liberal democracy. It may be more important in electoral democracies, that's less clear. There's little evidence that at least I could find that elite norms or weak elite norms lead to democratic breakdown unless the army is radical, interventionist, and anti-democratic. That undeniably is bad for democracy. And finally, based on the US income level and the US's long democratic experience and the lack of a Great Depression, the odds of democratic breakdown here would seem to be extremely low, which makes it all the more, I guess, ironic that the Polity team lowered the US rating to not a democracy in 2020. They might be proved right in the future if we see continued deterioration, but at present, that looks to me like an overreaction. I think it's more reasonable to see the US as an imperfect, but still continuing, surviving liberal democracy. Thanks.
Okay, terrific, Dan. Well, lots of great material covered in these papers, all kinds of levels of analysis, great insights on these big pictures of democratization. And we're really fortunate that our own Ricarda Hammer from here at WCED, our postdoc, was willing to serve as first responder, if you will, and offer some reactions to the papers and to the themes. So Ricky, without further ado, why don't you give us some feedback?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. So I'm not a political scientist. I'm an outsider here. And I will simply try to provoke some discussion and conversation based on that perspective. So all the papers we just heard deal with this very immensely important issue marking our contemporary moment, right? The inability of liberal democracies to guard against the forces of the market, leading to corruption, state repression, and violence, a widespread break with voter concerns in favor of elite demands, which further entrenches socioeconomic inequalities, and yet the perhaps surprising stability of what Munck calls low quality democracies. So even cases that were once held up as hopeful democratization stories have raised alarm. Think, for example, of the extrajudicial execution of a Black man by security forces steered by the regime of a media tycoon and the consolidation of the country's corrupt elite's influence on politics. Recent developments have raised significant concerns about the independence of the political process, the integrity of campaign funding, and the protection of individual rights. And I am, of course, talking here about the United States. So my point is not simply that the United States should be included in your analyses. Treisman's paper, after all, does grapple with the political situation in the US. Rather, my point is more foundational. Your papers tend to rely on an implicit comparison, right? Democratic ceiling as opposed to what? Backsliding as opposed to what? Progress as opposed to what? Low quality democracies as opposed to what? And I read with interest Munck's critique of the universalism of Western models, and yet the theoretical concepts in your papers are relational and they're normative, because operating in your very language is an ideal type of what democracy is meant to look like, an ideal type that rests on a very particular reading of Western democracies at a specific point of time, which then gets used to compare and contrast against democracies elsewhere. And this rests on a particular temporal politics, whereby, to quote the historian Deepesh Chakrabarty, the rest of the world is held in a waiting room of history. History is always already predetermined. The rest of the world is always catching up. Now, your diagnoses of Eastern Europe, Latin America, and East Asia are, of course, convincing, and the problems you analyze are well substantiated. But the implicit comparative framing raises question marks, particularly because Western democracies now more than ever show their inherent weaknesses, right? You highlight, for example, the importance of the rational legal state, which is undoubtedly important, but the framework of liberalism precisely also brings with it a huge tragedy. In fact, the continuing disaster of Western democracies, which should in fact lead us to question their ideal type status, is a very limited construction of who is seen to be a rights-bearing person. It has little to offer to those who find themselves outside the body politic, those subject to voting right attacks, disenfranchised prison populations, which we know disproportionately affects brown and Black populations, the estimated 11 million undocumented people with only very limited paths to citizenship in the United States, immigrant workers across Europe who are faced with increasingly more difficult and racialized paths to citizenship, and not to speak of the world's refugee population that falls between the cracks of the modern nation-state order. So my point is simply that all democratic projects currently find themselves in a difficult and also telling world historical moment. And rather than holding the Western model constant, it would be useful to locate all cases in this one historical moment. Now, the kinds of political problems democracies need to solve depend on their histories and also their specific positionalities within a larger global system. And this, I think, you note very beautifully. But again, to highlight this theoretically, one would need to theorize from your case's own longer historical trajectory rather than in relationship to an ideal type. And at the same time, it strikes me as important to acknowledge that these countries find themselves in a specific power position in a world system that again shapes the kinds of political choices its leaders have available to them. The papers do a great job of pointing to the confluence of market forces and their influence on democratic projects. And indeed, the promise of liberal democracies has, of course, been the idea that they could form a bulwark against political economic elites and to provide a speech valve for ordinary people. And yet across these papers, and also in the US, we find evidence of the influence of money in politics. And here I was wondering if you could answer the political economic question. What if the stories of a democratic ceiling are not only national stories, but indeed the overdetermining influence of capitalism on the political process, perhaps though with the added difference that in the context of the global South, we call these processes clientelism and corruption, and in the US simply politics. And finally, let me end on a more positive note. So just as much as I see the rather depressing picture that you're painting, we have also in the last couple of years seen an unprecedented uptick in popular movements, right? From Chile to Hong Kong, to Palestine, to Poland, to the US. Millions of people in the last few years have taken to the streets to demand their voice in the political project. So if indeed political elites have reached a democratic ceiling through electoral politics, might not the revived mobilization of the unheard, the working class, the disenfranchised, oppressed, and marginalized point a way forward? And if so, would not this rise of popular politics be the dominant trend in democracies today? All right, so I look forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ricky. Fantastic comments, really thought-provoking. And I wanted to just, before we turn it back to the panelists, I wanted to sort of add, because I had some similar reactions to Ricky, and these might kind of fit into the same kind of category, but I was reminded as I was listening to the papers of a little argument I once got in with someone about Indonesia and about democratization in Indonesia. And this person was lamenting, and they sort of said in frustration, they said, well, all democratization is meant in Indonesia is the democratization of corruption. To which I replied, well, it's Indonesia. What would you democratize other than corruption? And the point being, I think that we shouldn't necessarily expect that changing the regime to a democracy should change the deepest set and established features of the countries in which the democracy arises. So whether it's state weakness in Latin America, or it's nationalist fervor in East Asia, or whether it's corruption, Ricky's point well taken, right, on how we talk about corruption, but corruption in Eastern Europe, that these are simply features that there's no real reason, we don't really have theoretical reason to believe that democracy should change these things in a fundamental way. So there's a sense, a kind of a teleological sense that once you're a democracy, we think democracy should keep improving. But insofar as democracy is running up against those, those deep structural features, I'm not sure we have any reason to think that we should expect democracy to weaken those features. And at the end of the day, what that suggests, to again use the metaphor of the room that Ricky used, it might not so much be that these countries are struggling with the democratic ceiling as much as when countries democratize, they enter very different rooms. So countries are different for all kinds of historical reasons, and that at the end of the day, what we might be seeing is just certain types of democracies are remaining the same type they are. They're not quote unquote improving or raising the ceiling, but what that would really mean is becoming a different type of country, a different type of political economy, different type of state, if you will. And so that might be also worth thinking about when using the ceiling metaphor. But that's a lot from both me and Ricky, and then you obviously have a lot to respond to with each other as well. Anybody care to respond thus far? Before we have a couple of audience questions, but any reactions to these broader themes first from the organizers or others on the panel? Yeah, Jerry?
Yes, I'd be happy to respond. Let me start with yours, Dan, and then Ricky's comments. So Ricky, you bring a sociological perspective that political scientists sometimes don't have or forget. So I think it's very useful, the points that you made. So starting with Dan, in the 1980s and 1990s, in the process of democratization, people expected that democracy would solve a whole bunch of other problems. So we're catching up. We're realizing what you're saying. There's some structures. This is Aram, how she started her discussion. There's some structural factors that limit, how good democracies are, what democracies are going to deliver. I think Adam Jaworski in his 2010 book does a very nice job sort of being careful about how much you demand from democracy. If you demand too much, then people will become disappointed. And there are some very severe limits. He focuses a lot on sort of income redistribution in terms of what can be attained by democracy. But I think that's still news. I think we're catching up with that. That's certainly not where people were mentally and how people thought politically about democracy back a couple of decades ago. Turning to Ricky's comment, let me sort of agree and then sort of defend a little bit, sort of at least how I'm thinking. Yeah, sort of. So I'm totally with you. We don't want to take the West as a universal model. We should be critical of democratic weaknesses in the United States and European countries. I have my graduate seminar on democracy. We're meeting tomorrow. We're reading Michael Hansard's book on the specter of race. He raises a whole bunch of issues about sort of race in the United States, France, the UK. I think we haven't taken on board. He talks about racial regimes in the literature. So we talk a lot about economic inequality. I'd say we do quite a good job sort of in terms of embedding democracy in the context of capitalism. We haven't done a good job with regard to race. And so to be critical of sort of the central countries, the Western countries in terms of their shortcomings. The role of money in the United States is scandalous. I think it's less of an issue in European countries, but those are things that are important to criticize. Still sort of, I grew up in Argentina, so we just had elections on the weekend. There's a difference between Argentina and Scandinavia. It's like, it's like you travel to these countries, you follow the political processes. You don't have rampant vote buying. You don't have sort of the state using its resources at election time. You don't have politicians, candidates and office holders being killed as you have in Mexico. Yes, so there is a difference between sort of how democracy works and I take Western Europe or take sort of some of the best of Scandinavian. I wouldn't put maybe the United States in some of those regards sort of as a model. But in Latin America, we look to Europe and say, I wish I had the problems that they have. Yeah. So it's not an ideal or sort of a universal model, but it provides, and I'd say sort of a realistic contrast. Some countries have attained that. We haven't. So I think it's useful empirically as a contrast. And I think that's a little bit how we're using it. Sort of. There's a democratic ceiling because I'm not sure how people have sort of in other regions, but in Latin America we have sort of the European model. We didn't attain that, so that's the idea of democratic ceiling is a bit empirically anchored with that. What was an ideal for us in Latin America.
Okay, excellent. So I'm going to just make sure that our audience gets in here. So we have a couple questions I'm going to bring from the audience, both of which were asked by other fantastic fellows here at WCED, in addition to Ricky. So first of all, we have a question from Adam Casey, and he asked it specifically of Jerry, but I think this is a more general question once you get through all of the papers. And this is about why democratic collapse has tended to occur since 1989, more through the ballot box than through the barracks. And so Adam was curious by why in Latin America there's been this decline in coups, but as Dan Treisman's paper showed, this is a more general pattern. So if others have thoughts on why that might be a broader pattern in any of your particular regions, in East Asia, this is certainly true as well. Be worthy of reflection. And also a question from Natalia Forat, also here at WCED. And she's got a question specific to Dan Treisman about how support for democracy is measured and whether the increase of support for democracy could be a sign of a problem in world value surveys, which is that in the world value surveys tends to be the case that democracy is more valued in less democratic countries. The explanation being that if there are no problems with democracy, expressing support for it is not something that feels urgent for the people. So could that be part of what's going on with those, I think, really phenomenally interesting diagrams you showed, Dan, where you show the exact opposite effects of public support for democracy and then how experts are coding how democratic a country is. So does anybody want to take, we've got about 5 minutes or so everybody should feel free to take a minute or so to respond to any of these things that are on the table. Anybody want to go first? Dan? Yeah.
Yeah, just very quickly to respond to Natalie's question, that's exactly how I interpret it. It seems that, it's not surprising that as perhaps democracy becomes less effective, as countries become less democratic, people would care more about democracy and they would start to rally behind it. The point I was making was just that the argument that actual institutions of democracy have been eroding because there isn't public support for it doesn't really fit the data unless you assume really rather a big lag. I just think the way we think about these things needs to be more carefully worked out. And but yes, in terms of what's going on, I would interpret the graphs in the same way. These data are kind of a composite of World Values Survey, Eurobarometer, Latino Barometer, all these polls which have been combined using a Bayesian latent variable model by Chris Klassen.
Well, it also, the reverse is also interesting from a democratic ceilings perspective, which is if it's the case that when democracy is relatively healthy, people don't push for it to improve. They start to take it for granted. There's a kind of complacency. This would also explain why we might see a lack of democratic improvements. But Grigore, you had your hand up. Did you want to jump in on this?
Yes, so I think that this question of democratic support is a tricky one, and as somebody who's guilty of having written papers, explaining these kinds of democratic attitudes, I want to tread carefully here, but I think there's sort of two aspects that we need to keep into account. One of them is that this sort of general profession of love for democracy does not probably mean a whole lot when it comes down to defending democracy against a coup or something like that. And I think that's for two reasons. One of them is that there's a sort of normative sense in which you're supposed to say that you like democracy. And so maybe certain more specific questions about, whether you want to give your opponents the right to a fair trial and whether you want to, push against your party using whatever tricks it takes to win the next elections, that might actually be an important component of this. The other one, and I think this gets back a little bit to this question about the military as well, is that maybe looking at the average support for democracy in a country may not be enough, right? So if in the US, Democrats are pro-democracy and enough of the Republicans are anti-democratic, and the anti-democratic Republicans take control of the Republican Party, who then in turn, take control of the country, you could get a pretty bad outcome while the average support for democracy still looks okay. And then even more extremely, going back to the anti-democratic militaries, right? If democratic support in particular crucial institutions, whether it be the military or maybe parts of of Congress or whatever political institutions, if democracy support and democratic norms decline there, you could have a problem even if the average person that you ask in a survey would say, yeah, we're fine with democracy.
Aram, did you want to have the last? We have a few minutes left. I want to make sure you get, as one of our organizers, make sure you get a word in as well.
Yeah, I mean, oh my gosh, Ricky, thank you so much for, I've just been sitting here thinking while others have been responding. And I guess, one thing I'll say is, and then Dan, you mentioned this too, why should we expect things to change just because regime has changed, whereas all the other stuff like state legacies and the society conflicts are remain the same? And I guess there's no theoretical reason, but, that was definitely not the sense on the ground in a lot of these countries, including the ones that I study, when, people laid down their lives for democratization. And I think, perhaps the way to, perhaps what's missing from the way that we frame the question is not only just why do democratic ceilings persist, but why do they persist despite actually the masses wanting better? Because I think if you ask any of these citizens, not in sort of a survey, how, strongly do you support democracy, but if you actually get down to their level and talk to them, I think many are from generations where their parents, a lot of their classmates died protesting on the streets, were shot to death, were tortured by authoritarian regimes, for the sake of democracy. And I think acknowledging probably that expectation, that desire is an incredibly important part of why we care about this project. And I think also it was one of the prior questions, I can't remember who asked it, but why do we not see sort of more military coups? Because I think democracy matters. I think, and we try to stay away from sort of the ceiling floor concept, but a floor does exist in the sense that once you go that route, we have collectively crossed a certain irreversible line. I think especially for countries where there is sort of this bottom-up democratization that certainly rings true. So even for the most scheming, I think, politician, like that remains sort of this line, like, do you really want to cross that? In terms of the historical baggage that brings up with it. So I do think there is sort of this constraining factor. The regime type does matter. If it did not, even in sort of a motivational sense, then people would not have died for it, right? The question then is, how do we do justice to those desires and hopes, and why do these regimes, fail to live up to that, even with the institutions in place? Something else is going on, and I think a lot of the papers stem from sort of responsibility as political scientists to be able to answer that question.
Terrific. Well, paradoxes certainly abound. That is for sure when democracy is concerned. So I'm going to have to wrap it up just a minute here, but I just wanted to say, first of all, this is our last event of the fall semester here at WCED. I would encourage everybody to go take a look at the other events we've had on our website. It's been a really interesting fall, both of virtual and in-person events. We'll have a lot more in-person events in the winter. I want to give a very, very big thanks to Derek Groom, who always does an amazing job of putting these events together and making them work seamlessly, whatever format, hybrid or otherwise that we have. He's magnificent. Thank you, Derek. And most of all, thanks to our panelists here today, Grigore Pop-Eleches, Aram, Dan Treisman, Ricky Hammer, Jerry Munck. Thank you guys so much. And we look forward to seeing you hopefully at more events this year. Our theme for the year, as Ricky intimated, is capitalism and democracy. So we'll be talking a lot more about some of these big structural forces which coexist with democracy, and maybe have a lot to say about how our democratic fates actually look. So thanks so much again. Everybody have a great holiday and look forward to seeing you all soon. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dan.
Thanks.
Goodbye, everybody.
Bye,
Have a good
to see
day.
you, everybody.